There is a leash around your neck that you cannot see. You've worn it so long that you've forgotten it's there. It doesn't chafe. It doesn't hurt. Most of the time, you don't even feel it. But it is always there, quietly steering you, pulling you towards some choices and away from others, telling you what to say and what to swallow, what to want and what to hide. And the strangest thing about this leash is that no one else is holding it. You are. You put it on yourself long ago, and you have been holding your own leash ever since, walking exactly where it tells you to walk and calling it your life. That leash is the need for approval, the deep, constant, mostly invisible need to be liked, to be accepted, to be thought well of by others. And Friedrich Nietzsche understood, better than almost any thinker who ever lived, that this need is the single greatest obstacle standing between you and your freedom. Not other people, not circumstances, not the world. The invisible leash of needing their approval that is the thing that has kept you small, kept you obedient, kept you living a life shaped by the opinions of people who will one day be dust, and who mostly aren't even thinking about you at all. Nietzsche spent his life at war with this need. He watched the human herd his word for the mass of people who move together, think together, want together, terrified of standing apart. And he saw how the craving for approval turned free individuals into obedient members of the flock. He saw people betray their deepest instincts, abandon their real desires, and shrink their souls down to a socially acceptable size, all to purchase the approval of others. And he saw the rare few who broke free, who stopped needing to be liked, stopped seeking permission, stopped living for the verdict of the crowd, and he understood that in that break, and only in that break, was real freedom to be found. Today, I'm going to walk you through Nietzsche's philosophy of approval and freedom, why the need for approval is a prison, where it comes from, what it costs you, and how the moment you stop seeking it is the exact moment you become free. This will not be a gentle video. Nietzsche was never gentle. He wrote like a man trying to wake the sleeping, and he did not care if the waking was uncomfortable. But by the end, you may finally understand the leash you've been wearing your whole life, and you may finally be ready to take it off. If you're tired of living for other people's approval, type "I take off the leash" in the comments. Let's begin. Let's start by understanding just how deep this need runs, because most people have no idea how thoroughly their lives are shaped by the craving for approval. It's not just the obvious moments, the times you consciously want someone to like you. It's woven into the very fabric of your being, operating far beneath your awareness, shaping decisions you think are entirely your own. The career you chose, was it your desire or the desire to be seen as successful in the eyes of others? The opinions you hold, did you arrive at them yourself, or did you absorb them because they're the acceptable opinions, the ones that keep you safely inside the approving circle? The way you dress, the way you speak, the things you pursue, the parts of yourself you show and the parts you hide, how much of all of it is genuinely you and how much is a performance calibrated, moment by moment, to win the approval of an audience? Nietzsche's unsettling answer is far more than you think. For most people, the self they present to the world, and even the self they believe themselves to be, is largely a construction built to earn approval. They are not living their own lives. They are living the life that gets applauded. And the tragedy is that they don't even know it, because the need for approval operates so quietly, so constantly, that it feels like their own free will. They think they're choosing, when really, the leash is choosing for them. You have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, the correct way, and the only way, it does not exist. This is the first crack of light. Nietzsche is telling you that there is no single correct way to live, that everyone must approve of, that the entire idea of a universal standard you must meet to be acceptable is a fiction. And yet most people live as though such a standard exists, as though there is a right way to be that others will approve of, and their whole life becomes an anxious effort to conform to it. But if there is no single right way, if the standards you're straining to meet are just the arbitrary preferences of the herd around you, then the entire project of seeking universal approval collapses. You've been trying to win a game that doesn't exist, contorting yourself to meet a standard that was never real, seeking the approval of people who themselves are just following the crowd, who have no more authority to judge your life than you have to judge theirs. So where does this need come from? Why is it so deep, so universal, so hard to escape? Nietzsche understood that it has ancient roots, that it goes all the way back to our nature as social animals, and to the long history of the herd. For most of human existence, to be cast out of the group meant death. The individual alone, exiled from the tribe, could not survive. And so we evolved a deep, instinctual terror of disapproval, of rejection, of being cast out because for our ancestors, disapproval could be a death sentence. The need for approval is not a character flaw. It's an ancient survival mechanism, burned into us across countless generations, when belonging to the group was literally a matter of life and death. But here is what Nietzsche saw so clearly. That ancient mechanism, which once kept us alive, has become the very thing that keeps us from living. The conditions have changed. You will not die if people disapprove of you. You will not perish if you're rejected, disliked, cast out of some social circle. But the ancient terror doesn't know that. It still screams as though your life depends on approval, still floods you with dread at the thought of disapproval, still drives you to conform, to please, to seek permission, as though the tribe might exile you into the wilderness to die. And so you spend your life obeying a survival instinct that is no longer serving your survival, but is instead strangling your freedom. The leash that once tethered you safely to the life-giving group now tethers you to a herd that is drowning your individuality. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often, and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. Sit with that final phrase, the privilege of owning yourself. Nietzsche understood that to become an individual, a true self-owned individual, you have to struggle against the pull of the tribe, against the ancient instinct to merge with the herd and win its approval. And he was honest about the cost. It means loneliness, at times, and fear. When you stop seeking approval, when you begin to stand apart, you will feel the ancient terror rise up, screaming that you're in danger, that you'll be cast out, that you must get back in line. And you will sometimes feel alone, because the herd does not warmly embrace those who step outside it. But Nietzsche's verdict is absolute. No price is too high for owning yourself. Because the alternative, a whole life spent as a well-approved member of the herd, having never once owned your own soul, is the greater tragedy by far. Now let's talk about what the need for approval actually costs you. Because until you feel the full weight of the price, you won't be willing to pay the price of freedom. And the cost is staggering. It's nothing less than your authentic self. Every time you shape yourself to win approval, you cut away a piece of who you actually are. You have a genuine thought, but it might not be approved of, so you swallow it and say the acceptable thing instead, and a piece of your authentic mind dies. You have a real desire, but it doesn't fit the mold of what's admired, so you abandon it and pursue what's applauded instead, and a piece of your authentic will dies. You have a true feeling, an honest reaction, a real preference, but you sense it wouldn't land well, so you hide it behind the mask of what's expected, and a piece of your authentic heart dies. Do this for years, for decades, thousands upon thousands of times, and you slowly disappear. You become a hollow performance of a person, a collection of approved-of behaviors wearing your face, with the real you buried so deep beneath the performance that you can barely remember it was ever there. The man of knowledge must be able not only to love his enemies, but also to hate his friends. This is a shocking line, but Nietzsche is making a profound point about the corruption of approval seeking. When you need everyone's approval, even your friends, you cannot be honest. You cannot disagree, cannot challenge, cannot be your true self, because all of that risks the approval you crave. The need for approval makes you a coward in your own relationships, endlessly agreeable, endlessly accommodating, never willing to risk the friction that honesty requires. The free person, by contrast, values truth over approval, even with those closest to them. They can challenge a friend, disagree with the group, stand apart from those they love, not out of cruelty, but out of a commitment to their own truth that runs deeper than their need to be liked. The approval seeker sacrifices their honesty on the altar of being liked. The free person keeps their honesty and lets the approval fall where it may. And here is perhaps the deepest cost of all, the one Nietzsche saw most clearly. The need for approval doesn't just make you hide your real self, it actively prevents you from ever becoming who you could be. Because becoming real growth, real transformation, real greatness almost always requires stepping outside what's currently approved of. Every person who ever became something remarkable had to, at some point, defy the crowd, break with convention, pursue a path the herd disapproved of. The artist who creates something new, the thinker who challenges accepted ideas, the individual who lives by their own values rather than the crowd's, all of them had to be willing to lose approval in order to become who they were. And the person trapped in the need for approval can never do this. They are chained to what's currently acceptable, and so they can never venture into the new, the untried, the disapproved of territory where all real becoming happens. Their potential dies inside the cage of the crowd's approval. Become who you are. This was one of Nietzsche's central commands, and it stands in direct opposition to the need for approval. You cannot become who you are while you are busy becoming who others want you to be. These are opposite directions. Every step toward the crowd's approval is a step away from your own authentic self. Every act of conformity is a small betrayal of who you were meant to become. To become who you are, Nietzsche's highest calling for a human life, you must be willing to stop becoming who they want, to disappoint the crowd, to lose their approval, and to follow instead the deep, often unpopular pull of your own genuine nature. The need for approval and the command to become yourself cannot both be obeyed. You must choose. Now let's go deeper into the psychology, because Nietzsche understood something dark and important about why people cling so desperately to approval, and it connects to his concept of resentment and to the difference between what he called master morality and slave morality. Stay with me, because this is one of his most powerful insights. Nietzsche observed that there are roughly two fundamental orientations a person can have toward their own values. In the first, which he associated with strength and self-possession, a person determines their own values from within. They look inward, decide what is good and worthy according to their own judgment, and live by it regardless of whether the crowd agrees. Their sense of worth comes from themselves, from living according to their own standards. In the second orientation, which he associated with weakness, a person takes their values from outside, from what the group approves of, from what earns them acceptance and praise. Their sense of worth is entirely dependent on external validation. They feel good about themselves only when others approve, and they feel worthless when others don't. They have outsourced the verdict on their own soul to the crowd. He who cannot obey himself will be commanded. This is the crux of it. If you cannot obey yourself, if you cannot determine your own values, set your own standards, and validate your own worth from within, then you will inevitably be commanded from without. You will be ruled by the approval and disapproval of others, because you have no internal source of value to rule yourself by. The person who validates themselves from within is self-commanded, sovereign, free. The person who needs external approval is commanded by others, ruled by the crowd, a subject rather than a sovereign. And the difference between these two lives is the difference between freedom and servitude. Nietzsche wanted you to become the self-commanding kind, to build an internal source of worth so strong that you no longer need the crowd's approval to feel valuable, because you have become the author of your own value. And here's the uncomfortable part, the part that stings. Nietzsche understood that the need for approval often masks a deep weakness dressed up as virtue. The person who is endlessly agreeable, endlessly accommodating, endlessly seeking to please, they often think of themselves as kind, as good, as considerate. But underneath, Nietzsche would say, is frequently not virtue, but fear. The fear of disapproval, the weakness of a soul that cannot bear to stand alone, that needs the crowd's validation to feel real. What looks like niceness is often cowardice. What looks like humility is often the absence of a self strong enough to assert itself. This is hard to hear, because we're taught that seeking to please others is admirable. But Nietzsche invites you to look deeper, to ask whether your accommodating nature comes from genuine strength and choice, or from a fearful weakness that dares not risk disapproval. The distinction matters enormously, because one is freedom and the other is bondage, wearing the mask of virtue. Let me be careful and precise here, because this philosophy can curdle into something ugly, and I won't let it. Nietzsche is not telling you to become cruel, callous, or contemptuous of others. He is not saying you should stop caring about people, stop being kind, or take pleasure in others' disapproval. Freedom from the need for approval is not the same as contempt for others. The goal is not to become someone who delights in being disliked. That's just approval-seeking inverted, still defining yourself in relation to the crowd, just in the opposite direction. The goal is to become genuinely free of the whole game, to no longer need approval and no longer need disapproval, to simply be yourself, do what you believe is right, treat others with whatever kindness flows naturally from your own values, and let their opinions of you become genuinely irrelevant to your sense of who you are. The free person can still be warm, still be kind, still care about others, but from a place of fullness and choice, not from a desperate need to be validated. That distinction is everything. Now let's talk about the moment, because the title promises a moment, and Nietzsche understood that there really is one. The moment you stop seeking approval, you become free. It's not a gradual, mushy process of slowly caring a little less. There is a genuine threshold, a real shift, a moment when something breaks and everything changes. And I want to describe it precisely, so you can recognize it when it comes, or better, so you can choose to make it come. The moment is this. It's when you finally stop asking the question, "What will they think?" and start asking instead, "What do I think? What is true for me? What do I actually want, believe, and value?" It's the moment you take the verdict on your own life back from the crowd and place it firmly in your own hands. It's the moment you decide that your own judgment of yourself matters more than the collective judgment of people who barely know you and will soon forget you. In that moment, the leash doesn't slowly loosen, it snaps. Because the leash was never made of the crowd's opinions. It was made of your need for those opinions. And the moment you stop needing them, the leash simply ceases to exist. The crowd can still think whatever it thinks, but it no longer has any power over you, because you've stopped handing it that power. No price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. This is why Nietzsche returned to the idea of self-ownership again and again. The moment of freedom is the moment you finally own yourself. The moment you reclaim your soul from the crowd and take full possession of your own life. Before that moment, you belonged, in a sense, to others, to their opinions, their approval, their expectations. Your life was collectively owned by the herd. After that moment, you belong to yourself. Your life is your own, to live by your own values, according to your own judgment, in pursuit of your own becoming. And that self-ownership is what freedom actually is. Not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the deeper freedom of being the author of your own life, the sovereign of your own soul, no longer ruled by the invisible leash of needing others to approve. Let me describe what life looks like on the other side of that moment, because it's genuinely transformative, and I want you to see the destination clearly enough to want to reach it. The person who has stopped seeking approval moves through the world with a lightness that the approval seeker can never know. The enormous energy they use to spend monitoring others' reactions, calculating how to be liked, adjusting themselves to win approval, all of that energy comes home to them and becomes available for actually living. They speak more honestly because they're no longer filtering every word through the question of whether it will be approved. They pursue what they actually want because they're no longer abandoning their desires to chase what's admired. They can disagree without terror, stand apart without collapse, be disliked without devastation because their sense of worth no longer depends on the crowd's verdict. They have become, in the truest sense, free. And here's the paradox that Nietzsche understood. the one that always surprises people. The person who stops needing approval often becomes more magnetic, more respected, more genuinely admired than they ever were when they were desperately seeking it. Because there is nothing more compelling than a person who is authentically themselves, who doesn't need your validation, who is sovereign and self-possessed and free. The approval seeker, paradoxically, repels approval through their neediness. The free person, who needs nothing, draws it effortlessly. But, and this is crucial, the free person doesn't care. That's the whole point. The approval that now flows toward them is pleasant but irrelevant. They've stopped needing it, and so they're finally free, whether they receive it or not. And that freedom, that not needing, is precisely what makes them so magnetic. You cannot fake it, and you cannot pursue it as a strategy, because the moment you're seeking the approval that comes from not needing approval, you're back in the cage. The freedom is only real when the not needing is real. So, how do you actually get there? How do you reach the moment? And how do you live from it once you've crossed the threshold? Nietzsche's philosophy points toward a real path, and I want to give it to you clearly and practically, because understanding the prison is not the same as walking out of it. The first step is to become conscious of the leash, to see clearly how much of your life is governed by the need for approval. Start noticing throughout your day the moments when you shape yourself to win approval, the opinion you soften, the desire you hide, the true thing you don't say, the mask you put on, the way you calibrate yourself to the people around you. Most of this happens unconsciously, automatically, so the work is to bring it into the light. Watch yourself. Catch the approval seeking as it happens. Notice how often and how deeply the question, "What will they think?" is silently steering your choices. You cannot take off a leash you can't see, so the first work is simply to see it, to become fully aware of how thoroughly the need for approval has been running your life. That awareness alone begins to loosen its grip. The second step is to begin, deliberately, to disappoint the crowd in small ways, to practice the muscle of losing approval and surviving it. This is essential, because the need for approval is sustained by the untested belief that disapproval would be catastrophic. So you have to test it. Start small. Express a genuine opinion that you know won't be universally approved. Say no to something you'd normally say yes to out of the fear of disappointing. Show a real preference. Make a choice the crowd wouldn't applaud. Let yourself be seen doing something that isn't calibrated for approval. And then notice what happens. You survive. The catastrophe you feared doesn't come. The disapproval, when it comes at all, is bearable. Far more bearable than the slow death of your authentic self. Each time you lose a little approval and survive, the ancient terror loses a little of its power, and you reclaim a little more of your freedom. This is how you retrain the survival instinct that no longer serves you, by showing it, again and again, that disapproval is not death. That which does not kill me makes me stronger. Apply this directly to disapproval. Every experience of being disliked, rejected, disapproved of, and surviving it makes you stronger, more free, less enslaved to the need for approval. The approval seeker avoids all disapproval, and so never builds the strength that comes from surviving it, and remains forever fragile, forever dependent on being liked. The person becoming free deliberately exposes themselves to disapproval in manageable doses, survives it, and grows stronger with each experience until eventually disapproval loses its terror entirely, and they stand free. What doesn't kill you, and disapproval will never kill you, makes you stronger. So stop avoiding it. Let it strengthen you into freedom. The third step is to build an internal source of worth, to become the author of your own value, so that you no longer need the crowd to validate you. This is the deep work, the permanent solution. As long as your sense of worth depends on external approval, you will always be vulnerable to the need for it, no matter how many times you practice defiance. The real freedom comes when you develop your own standards, your own values, your own judgment of what makes a life worthy, and you begin to validate yourself according to those internal standards rather than the crowd's. Ask yourself, by my own deepest values, am I living well? Am I honest? Am I courageous? Am I becoming who I'm meant to be? When you can answer those questions from within, and when your own answer matters more to you than anyone else's opinion, you've built the internal citadel that makes you free. Your worth now comes from a source that no crowd can touch, because you generate it yourself. This is what Nietzsche meant by obeying yourself, by being self-commanded, by becoming the author of your own value. Build that internal source, and the need for external approval simply withers because you no longer need what it was providing. The fourth step is to embrace the loneliness and fear that come with freedom, rather than fleeing back to the herd. Nietzsche was honest that the path to self-ownership involves loneliness and fear, that stepping outside the herd means giving up the warm, easy belonging of the approved of and facing, at times, the cold and the solitude of standing apart. Most people, feeling this loneliness and fear, flee back to the herd, back to the comfort of approval, and put the leash back on. The person becoming free does something harder. They stay. They accept the loneliness as the price of self-ownership. They let the fear rise up the ancient terror of exile, and they do not obey it. They remember Nietzsche's verdict: no price is too high for owning yourself. And they discover, on the far side of that loneliness and fear, a solitude that is not empty but full, the rich, sovereign solitude of a person who belongs, finally and completely, to themselves. The loneliness of freedom is real, but it is infinitely better than the crowded loneliness of a self-surrendered to the herd. And the fifth step, underlying all the others, is to fall in love with your own becoming, to become so committed to growing into who you truly are that the crowd's approval becomes a small thing next to it. Remember Nietzsche's command, become who you are. When that becoming becomes your deepest commitment, when growing into your fullest, truest, most authentic self matters more to you than anything, then the need for approval naturally fades, because you can see clearly that approval seeking is the enemy of becoming. You can't grow into who you are while shrinking into who they want. And once you're truly committed to your own becoming, once you've tasted the aliveness of growing into your real self, the crowd's approval loses its allure. Who would trade the magnificent adventure of becoming who they are for the small gray comfort of being approved of by the herd? Once you've glimpsed the alternative, the leash loses its appeal, and freedom becomes not just possible, but irresistible. Here is what Nietzsche ultimately understood, and what I want you to carry out of all of this. The need for approval is the great invisible prison of human life. Most people are born into it, live their whole lives inside it, and die within it, never once having owned themselves, never once having become who they truly were, because they spent their entire existence seeking the approval of others, shaping themselves to be liked, living the applauded life rather than the authentic one. They wore the leash so long that they mistook it for their own will, and they walked exactly where it told them to walk, and called it freedom when it was the deepest bondage there is. And the great tragedy is that the prison was never locked. The door was always open. They could have walked out at any moment, simply by stopping by, ceasing to seek the approval that held them captive. But they never did, because they never saw the leash, or because they saw it and were too afraid of the loneliness and fear that freedom requires. You do not have to be one of them. The moment of freedom is available to you right now, today. It is the moment you stop asking what they will think and start asking what you think. The moment you take the verdict on your own life back from the crowd and claim it as your own. The moment you decide that owning yourself is worth the loneliness, worth the fear, worth the loss of the approval you've spent your whole life chasing. In that moment, the leash snaps, the prison door swings open, and you walk out into a freedom you have never known. The freedom of a person who belongs to themselves, who lives by their own values, who is becoming who they truly are, and who is finally, completely free. And here is the deepest truth of it, the one Nietzsche understood most profoundly. The freedom on the other side of approval seeking is not a lonely, cold, isolated freedom, though it passes through loneliness to get there. It is the richest, fullest, most alive way of being available to a human being. Because only the person who has stopped seeking approval can truly live, can speak their truth, pursue their real desires, become their authentic self, and taste the full aliveness of a life that is genuinely their own. The approval seeker never lives. They only perform, endlessly, for an audience that isn't even watching. But the free person lives, fully, boldly, authentically, on their own terms, by their own values, in pursuit of their own becoming. And that life, that free, self-owned, authentic life, is the only one worth living, and it becomes available the very moment you stop seeking approval and start owning yourself. So the choice before you is the one Nietzsche laid down: the herd or yourself, approval or freedom, the applauded life or the authentic one. You can keep wearing the leash, keep seeking the approval that has kept you small, keep living the life that gets liked while your real self withers unlived inside you. Or you can stop. You can take off the leash, walk out of the prison, endure the loneliness and fear that freedom requires, and claim the privilege that Nietzsche said no price was too high to pay for. The privilege of owning yourself. The moment you stop seeking their approval is the moment you become free. And that moment is not somewhere in the distant future. It is here, now, available to you, waiting only for your decision. So I'll leave you with the only question that matters. Will you keep living for the approval of a crowd that will soon forget you? Or will you take off the leash, own yourself, and finally become free? If your answer is the second one, drop "I own myself" in the comments right now. Speak it into existence. Make that promise to yourself. Because you were never meant to spend your one life as an obedient member of the herd, seeking permission to exist, shrinking yourself to be approved of. You were meant to become who you are, sovereign, authentic, free. The leash is in your own hands. It always was. And the moment you decide to drop it, the moment you stop seeking their approval, is the moment you finally, completely become free.